Coming up today, it's episode 84 of In the Front Row with Mike Vaccaro, featuring writer and author Scoop Jackson. We hear about the origins of his name and talk about his career that has origins in hip-hop and also in sports. Currently co-author of a book called Ice that features George Gervin. We learn about the lessons he learned from the NBA Hall of Famer. That plus his fandom for the White Sox, the Knicks, and much, much more. It's episode 84 featuring Scoop Jackson right here on In the Front Row with Mike Vaccaro. Well, Scoop, we appreciate you joining us here today. A lot to get into. Your background, obviously the new book that's out now, Ice, with George Gervin, and your role with that as a co-writer of that. But let's start at the beginning. And it's, your given name is Robert, but it's Scoop Jackson. Take us behind the scenes. Tell us about that and how that nickname came about.
Yeah, it was kind of given to me at birth, man. My mother's brother said to my father, who was a newspaper reporter at the time, he said, the news of you. Well, I was born the day after Kennedy's assassination. And at the hospital, my mother's brother made a joke to my father. He said, Bob, the news of you having a son is going to scoop, Kennedy. And they really stuck that with me at birth. It's there was a legend that's on my birth certificate. And then when I got my hands on my birth certificate, I found out it wasn't, but that's all. It's always been there. But then again, my father, we got birth certificate issues in my family. My father didn't know that his real name was not Robert until he was in his 30s. His real name is Bobby. So I'm supposed to be Robert III. But technically, I'm not because my father on his birth certificate. So it's all jacked up. But no, Scoop was given to me since birth. As a kid, it was always Scoopy with the Y. As I got older, the Y got dropped, which happens every now and then. But, my wife and people that have known me since day one, like aunties and uncles and all, they still call me Scoopy. And it's been Scoop to this day. So, I guess it's in honor of my father, I guess, because of his newspaper background. So I try to hold it down as best as possible.
Yeah, you mentioned your father. He was a writer for the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. How much of an influence was he on you in you becoming a writer and what you're doing now?
Not much at all, man. It's a strange story because as a reporter, and he was one of the first Black newspaper reporters in the country. As a reporter, I kind of got to watch what he did from afar, but still stayed connected to it. And I never wanted to be a reporter. I never looked at the writing aspect of it. I looked at what most reporters' jobs are before they get to having a reporter story, and that's to gather information. And in watching them, from afar do what they do, I looked at it as invasive. Now, my father and my mother divorced when I was in second grade. So you have to understand what the prism in which I'm seeing that through. I'm looking at what he did up close while he was in the house up until I was 7, maybe years old, something like that. You form different opinions. So I saw my father and saw the way they gathered news. They would run up on people and rush people and microphones and invasion of privacy and all that and the other. And I'm like, I never wanted to do that. So, and even as I got older and watched him do what he did for, a few years, it still became invasive to me. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. That didn't seem attractive to me. That's nothing I wanted to be a part of. But I think the writing side, as I got older and older, I became to recognize how good he really was because he was nominated for 2 Pulitzers. As a kid, that don't mean anything to you.
Yeah.
But in reading what he was writing when he got to Denver, I'm like, guy was really, really gifted. He really put in the work. So I gained another appreciation for what it was that he did. But I never looked at it as this is something I want to do. He wasn't the path. He wasn't the North Star for me to get into it because of the way I viewed what it was that he did as a kid. But as an adult, I can say that it's especially as a professional, it's pushed me to have a level that I have to reach and maintain. Not that I'm trying to, get nominated for Pulitzers like my father, but I understand there's a legacy there. And it's my responsibility now that I'm in this to uphold the legacy that he at least set, whether I'm connected to it or not. You know, I want him to, you know, live the back nine of his life knowing that my son got into the same field and, you know, he held it down. You know, whether it's Bobby, Robert, or Scoop, he held that Jackson name down. So yeah, you know, it did it in a unique way, but not in the way most people would think it did.
And so, you know, that influenced a little bit. You go to Xavier University in Louisiana, then eventually to Howard as well. Did you go there thinking that you were going to be a writer and with that, you know, in the front of your mind?
Never at all. I went to I started off at Xavier with a major wanted to be a lawyer, and I loved politics. So my major was political science. It's at the end of my sophomore year, we didn't have any money. So I had to drop out. And like really, I've always worked, but I had to really start working, like working for some real money, not working at McDonald's like I was doing. You know, I had to really like gain some money to pay back what we owed and get enough money to get back in school. You know, so the initial thing was to like, you know, really follow law. But as I got into law and what it took to become a lawyer and start studying cases, my interest waned away from that. Because I'm like, man, I'm early into this, and you still have to go to law school after this. It's not holding my interest. My love, you know, my love for it started to shift. But I've always been interested in media, newspapers. I always wanted to have my own magazine. You know, wanted to be a program director at a radio station. You know, love to advertise, all that stuff. I always loved those areas of communication. So by the time I got my money together and went back to Xavier to finish out my final 2 years, I switched my major from political science to communications. But by the time I went back, they were like, you are literally 2 classes away from graduating with a major in political science, because I was front heavy on taking political science classes.
Mm-hmm.
So I ended up double majoring, basically. First 2 years, I took the bulk of my class in political science. The next 2-3 years, I took them in mass communications. So I finished with a double major, but never with an intent to be a writer or reporter or anything. It was to, you know, find some space in some area of communication, you know. But it took a professor there by the name of Dr. Kent. And once again, we're kids, man. You know, we're not really kids like I was back in the day, but like 18 years old, and I'm watching TV and I see a commercial, and I tell Dr. Kent, I'm like, hey, man, I want to get into advertising. I want to. He said, okay. And I think he knew it happened. You know, I think he's been around kids long enough to know that, man, you're 18 years old. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. You know, you're 19, whatever it was. 18. I was a junior at the time. So basically, man, he gave me a test and put a paperclip on my desk and said, tomorrow, well, next class, because it was Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. He said, next class, I want you to come here and write me something about this paperclip. And I'm saying, what do you want me to write? He said, give me something about this paperclip. So I literally took it home, man, and that messed with my head for a while. I'm like, it's a paperclip. You know, what is that right? So I literally came back to the next class. I really had nothing. I'm like, I don't get, you know, I didn't get the assignment. And he said, that's advertising. You say you want to get in advertising. Your job as an advertiser is to tell me why I need this paperclip in my life. Your job in advertising is to sell me this paperclip. He said, you all sit up there and watch TV and think making commercials is cute and all this, that, and the other. But it starts with writing. You have to write something to move me about this paperclip. And that's when I was like, oh, you know, I get, you know, it snapped in my head like, oh, so this is what this is. And really, that's what started me really leaning into writing, that interest in trying to make that happen. And literally, I've been spending the next 30, 35 years trying to write something about that paperclip to move people. And that's really how it started. So it never started off as like me wanting to be I had no interest in being a journalist, no interest in really being a writer. But that moment with Dr. Kent shaped me on the importance of writing and the power that writing can have, and the skill you have to be powerful and have moves and be able to shape words to move people. And by the time I went to grad school, I still didn't necessarily want to be a writer. I still wanted to focus in some area of communications, but I understood that writing was the core of everything. Regardless of what area of communication you got into, writing was going to be the core.
Well, that paperclip eventually led to some pretty good jobs, some good publications as well. A lot
Yeah, I
of them
got lucky.
basketball related with Slam, hoop, inside stuff as well. One of your early, stories, articles you wrote was about Shaquille O'Neal. So you mentioned you didn't want to be invasive, put that camera, put that microphone in people's faces, but what you were doing, did it give you a chance to really dive deeper in and spend some time with some of these players?
Well, what it did, because it was a magazine platform as opposed to a newspaper platform, and the deadlines are shaped differently, it allowed, well, it allows us, but I'll just say me, it allowed me to approach the subject matter and the subjects a little differently, and not with the sense of urgency that often comes when you're a journalist at a newspaper, at a daily. So, was able to finesse situations in a way that there became a comfort level between the people I was doing stories on and whatever it was that we're talking about. And a lot of times, what I've learned in this business is that newspapers do not allow that to happen. The space is not there and the time is not there. But with doing magazine, like we're doing Slam, especially Slam, because that's where we really started off at in building that magazine. It gave us time because we weren't even a monthly magazine at the time. We were out every 6 weeks. And the space that you had to shape these stories and spend time with players and really get to know them and have your work be identified in a less crowded space, because there weren't a lot of annual, well, basketball magazines that were coming out more than one time a year. So the competition was different. And that space allowed the subject matters to really get into your work and know you without even knowing you personally. So all that worked in our favorite slam, definitely worked in my favorite slam. So, you know, like when we first started off with Shaquille O'Neal, that was my first feature story with Slam. He basically gave me he played me. He's like, oh man, yeah, well, give me 5 minutes, and I gave him 5 minutes, and they're like, man, Shaq left 3 minutes ago. I'm like, so I finally got him, and we finally did the interview. And once the story came out, I saw him like months later because it was his first time in the NBA Finals, and I was there at the finals. And before the game, he ran across the court and gave me a hug and thanked me for the story he did and apologized for how he played me. And that space kind of gave, I started learning how to approach things, but that space and ability to give those players that type of, foundation, that type of real estate to tell stories about them really started to resonate. And, Shaq was one of the first, but then there were others just afterwards, and Slam became a thing, and my writing became a thing because of the uniqueness in which I was telling their stories in a way that most other journalists at that time weren't. So it was, and once again, as I said earlier, I was trying to a certain degree hold down the legacy. Like I had a inborn responsibility as a writer to write at a certain level. So all of that kind of played itself into a great situation where I literally was doing almost the exact opposite of what my father was forced to do as a newspaper reporter, but as a magazine writer. Not necessarily a reporter, as a magazine writer, as a magazine journalist, I had, my approach and my space was different. And I tried to do what I could to take advantage of that. And, it ended up being pretty successful.
And a lot of sports, as we talked about, but also, you transition a little bit to hip hop as well. You were covering hip hop at the time, and now it's 50 years of hip hop as well. Did kind of one connect to the other? Is that how you transitioned a little bit?
No, well, here's the thing. The transition was to sports. Hip hop was always, Black culture, music, and hip hop were always at the forefront, because that's what I did my master's journal on. I did my math. Well, it wasn't a thesis because I wound up doing a journal, but it was my quote unquote master's thesis at Howard University. I did the first academic study in the country on hip hop. And because there was none out there, I couldn't even use anything as a swatch or something to play off of. I think Houston Baker was the first writer who ever really did something, but it really wasn't an academic study. But that was what I got my master's degree in, studying the pro-social effect hip hop could have on the Black community. And it ended up being a book. I just pulled the study out of it and just gathered the information and turned it into a book form. And I was writing for various rap magazines at the time, stuff in the source. I was writing for Rap Sheet in LA. We started a rap newspaper called Fly Paper here in Chicago. There was rap pages in Los Angeles. Everything was based on music and hip hop at the time. So the transition was to sports and basketball. The foundation was built off of music. So while we were doing Slam and we conceptualized the magazine Double XL, that wasn't a transition at all. That was like, hey, let's get back to where we started at. So we were able to create a magazine in a landscape where hip hop journalism had become a thing as well. But our job, like saying earlier about Slam, we want to do this on a higher level. We want to raise the level of hip hop journalism. We wanted to be with Double XL. We wanted it to be the Vanity Fair of hip hop. And at some points we kind of got there, but it kind of got away. But that was our intent. But I was lucky enough to be a part of, one of the creators and founders on the ground zero on getting that magazine off the ground. So it's it's the 50 years of hip hop, but I think it's like the 25th year, something like this. So it's nice to be a part of something that you can look at and say, hey man, it still has legs, it still has some relevancy, it's still important. And I think the stories that are being told in hip hop, for 50 years are important. And one of the things I think allowed the genre hip hop to last 50 years is that there was a journalistic component, that was able to establish itself in telling the stories and giving the music another dimension as opposed to the art side of it, as opposed to the music side of it, as opposed to all the other sides of it, even the entrepreneurial side of it. The journalism side of hip hop, I think, is just as much responsible for being around 50 years as anything else. So I'm glad I was able to, contribute to that.
Are you surprised that it's around 50 years later and being celebrated as much and as big as it seems that it is here this year?
In all honesty, I cannot give you a definite answer on that because it's yes and no. Because I came up in an era where I watched another form of, I'll say, boutique niche music that was somewhat rooted in urban America not have sustainability, and that's like disco. As a kid of the 70s, we watched disco come from a marginalized community, be it the gay, Black, Latino community, and become a big thing. And we were able to watch that genre literally get killed, get removed from the surface. So with hip hop coming on the backs of that and me being a product of that, of course, there's some hesitancy. We're like, okay, well, this might have a 10-year run. What's going to happen with this? And also watch and study, because part of the study I did when I did the study of hip hop and do the music and looking at the history and look at the alignment and the similarities of hip hop and bebop, of jazz music, and how the origins were basically the same, how the sensibilities of them were the same, how there's so many things connected to both forms of music that are so similar, they're just different time periods. And to look at what jazz had not necessarily been reduced to, but how it distanced itself from mainstream society when it used to be mainstream music in America. So with those two things, of course, I'm in the middle of hip hop thinking like, all right, I'm watching the same thing happen again, because whether history repeats itself or not, we know for sure that history does remix itself. So there's always a part of me that's thinking they're waiting for the drop off to come from hip hop. But, I thought there was such a strong populace with hip hop where it never really became fringed. It did reach a mainstream level. It did reach a pop level, but there was still an element of it that never got lost from which it came from. So I've always walked through these stages and these phases of hip hop, knowing that, well, there's this thing going on here, but there's still this thing going on here. So while you look at like a Kendrick Lamar, who started off as a LA-based prodigy, it rose to mainstream status where he's getting Pulitzers and selling out stadiums, but still has not lost that base, and cats is still mess with hardcore, like underground hip hop, still mess with him and give him credit. He never broke away, and while he's existing, there's a kid out of Atlanta called JID that is the next phase of him. That it's like, okay, if we do lose Kendrick, we got JID to fall back on. And if you look at the history of hip hop, that's always been there. Whether someone leaves, there's always somebody we can always fall back on. And that's the beauty of it. And that's why I'm not surprised that it's still around 50 years, because there's never really any true break off. Never ever been any true break off. And that's the beauty of it.
Yeah, one kind of leads to another. And that leads to, you mentioned jazz there, and smooth jazz, I think, is how you can kind of describe George Gervin and his game, right? Just a smooth guy, very interesting. So let's get into this book here now that's out. It's called Ice. You co-wrote it with him. It's published by Triumph Books, one of our friends who's helped us get some great guests, including yourself here. But what led to that? It's been obviously a number of years since George last played, but I'm sure it's a story that's great to read and to hear. But what led to the writing of that book, and now for the writing of that book?
George and his people, Mark Thomashaw specifically, who plays the role of his agent. But I know Mark and I worked together on a project with Nike called Sole Provider years ago in 2000. So when it came time to do his book, because he was in the middle of doing a documentary, and I still don't know who talked who into doing the book. If Mark talked George into like, hey man, you need to do a book, or George suggested it to him. I don't know the origins of where that came up, but I'm pretty sure in the process of doing the documentary, it's like you're already telling your story right now. You might as well get something else out of it. And my name came up, and from what I was told, that I was one of maybe three, but the other two they were like, we knew we wanted you from the beginning. Like I said, Mark and I had a relationship of working with Nike together. And George and I had a great relationship. And George has always respected my writing. I was able to do a story on George for one of the NBA magazines. And we stayed in contact since then. So they've always appreciated my work. And basically it was just a phone call. It was Thomashaw, like, hey man, Ice wants to know if you help him tell his story. And that's an easy yes. That's an easy yes. And a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Mark Spears, had just finished about a year ahead of time doing a book with Spencer Haywood for Triumph. So, I called him. I was like, hey, how are they to work with? He said, they're great. I was like, all right. George and Mark are asking me, and Mark Spears saying they're cool to work with. It's an easy go. Let's go. So it was really simple. It's one of those phone calls that you're honored to get every now and then in your life. So
obviously, again, a cool guy. He's got the name of Ice. He's got the great cover of that book as well. What did you learn about him? An NBA Hall of Famer in the ABA as well with the Spurs. What did you learn about him that maybe you didn't know?
That's a good question, man, because one of the things he told me early on, man, and I'm talking about not in doing the book, like early on, I think even probably before, because I had met George before I even did the story on him. I think I met him, if I'm correct, maybe at the NBA's 35th anniversary at the Hall of Fame in Cleveland. I think that's where I met him, in that room. Mm-hmm. And I remember him telling me something. I think I'm accurate on this. I know what I'm telling you is accurate, but I'm trying to think if the date is accurate. But he told me at the time when I met him, and we were just talking, and I was a Slam magazine at the time. And he said, man, I'm a relationship guy. I believe in relationships. He's like, I've been married to my wife for 27 years. I've been with Nike 26 years. I've been with the San Antonio Spurs 28 years. I believe in, relationships and holding down longevity with people you deal with. And that stuck with me like, damn, I'm like, I want to be like that. I'm serious. I want to have that says something to me about somebody. You know, to have those type of relationships for that long a period of time, it says something about that person. So going into the book, I've always kept that in mind. I've always tried to apply that to my life, you know. So when it came time to do the book, I knew that was George's foundation. Like that was a big part of who he was. And the book was like 15 years later after that. So now we're talking about he's been with his wife 40 something years. He's still working with the Spurs, you know, so he still hasn't lost that. So going into that as a foundation, it was easy for me to look at everything that happened to his life and attach it, you know, to those to that foundation. So it became just the small parts of who he was that are extensions of that I didn't know. That not necessarily the stories that you could find on Wikipedia or go back and do deep dives and stories that are written of what happened in his life. You know, it was more about I didn't know the small tentacles from that foundation of him being a relationship person that made me understand how he is that person. You know, how he was able to establish and maintain those relationships for that amount of time, and how we as people can take from that and apply that to our lives and become that type of person where you're able to have those things that mean something in your life, or those people or those organizations or whatever, for that amount of time. Um, and you know, those are the things that I walked away from the year we spent doing this book as also not just things about his life, but things about life in general that I can apply to my life to make myself a better person. His outlook on things, his perspective on things. You know, like how, if you read the book, how he handled the situation in college where he got into the fight, which is a story I didn't know. Where he got to the fight and like lost his college career because of a fight that he was in, and how that shaped him to become the person that he became. And he's like, I'm never going to ever, you know, lose my cool again. And you know, people think that his cool is about just he was born this way. He's like always been a cool dude, which he's always been kind of low key and, you know, cool. But that cool became purposeful because of an incident in his life. And, you know, knowing that story is one thing I didn't know, but it's more about how he applied that story to shape the person that he became. That he never gave anyone outside of his body and his being the power to throw him off of his axis in any situation. He's like, of course, I'm a human being, so I'm gonna get mad about certain things, but I'm never, ever, ever going to be knocked off of my axis to become somebody I'm not. You know, he was never gonna lose his cool anymore, ever. And to apply that to my life at damn near 60 years old now, and I've tried to do that, but to hear it from somebody and walk through his life and walk through his journey and get to see how he applied that at every step, and how he tells you stories, and you listen to these stories and you're saying to yourself, man, that would have pissed me off. But he keeps going back to like, nah, you know, he's flashing back to those moments and turning those moments that should be peril into moments of promise. And it's all about application. You know what I'm saying? It's all about application of how you apply certain things in your life and how you walk with that through the rest of your life. So those are the type of things that I learned and picked up throughout the book. So it's not just stories. It's like ways of life. You know, we could have named this book The Tale of Ice. You know what I'm saying? Because it really was a journey in self-fulfillment, in redemption, in like, you know, friendships and relationships and all that. So yeah, there was a lot I learned more about life in doing this with him than just about his life.
Yeah, that's really interesting again, because you know, you look at his career, an outstanding career, but for you, you got more out of spending time with him and hearing about his life as well. Is there anybody else that you've interviewed during your days that you've kind of taken stuff away like George Gervin here?
Yeah, definitely Julius Erving, who's a big part of this book because of the role he played in Ice's basketball career in his life to this day. But more than anybody, well, I'll say it this way: Julius Erving, Allen Iverson, Chris Webber, Grant Hill, From afar, Kevin Garnett. Kevin Garnett's like, I mean, it's much like Allen Iverson, to watching their lives from afar and what they've had to go through and how they sustain and how technically neither of them are supposed to be here. Has been amazing. I've been able to take watching their parts of life and apply it. But more than those people, anybody else has been Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali has been the one athlete that, from a words perspective, I've been able to, and from a life perspective to a certain degree, I've tried to take as much as I possibly can from him, and what he's meant and what he's fought for and what he survived and how he shaped that to, in the end, transition himself to be the human being that he became and what he represented. Not just for athletes, but for specifically Black male athletes. So he's definitely one without actually, and I met him early on in my life. And that always meant something to me. But just, he's probably the most written about individual in the history we've had in sports. So to read everything we've read, that's been written about him and use them as like, same, like Bibles as well, there's sports Bibles, the stories of his life and apply them. So out of everybody, I think Muhammad Ali probably trumps that. But I didn't get a chance to spend time with him the way I did George Gervin. But over the course of my life, I feel like I have by as much as I've read about his life and the time I spent reading about his life. So definitely.
You're about to turn 60, right?
Yeah, man, tomorrow.
So it sounds like you're a little bit more reflective as you look back at some of these guys. And again, great careers that they have, but it's more beyond that. Is that kind of what you're getting now as you look back at time spent with some of these athletes and learning their story and again, how you could pull that into what's becoming your story?
You know what? I have never looked at it that way. I probably am now that you mentioned it, but I've never, ever really looked at it that way, man. I've always tried to remove, even though it's kind of a juxtaposition you're in where you try to do both and you're fighting with both. It's like the yin and yang situation. I got great advice from the great writer, the legendary Brian Burwell from USA Today back in the day, early on in my career. And he told me, always put some of yourself in your story. And he didn't necessarily mean that by name. He meant that by spirit and soul and how you can find a unique voice and, engage yourself in what it is that you're doing as far as being a journalist and being a writer and being a storyteller. There should always be some of you in what it is that you do. But I've always, at the same time, tried to remove myself from whatever situation, the story I'm doing, and let the story be. And let the subject matter of the story be at the front, and me having the responsibility of telling that story, not my story, not my part of the story, not the story from my point of view, but a story about them or the subject matter in a way that nobody else has. So the story is always led with me. So I've never, even though I've always taken what Brian has told me into what it is that I do, I've always, from my perspective, removed myself from the situation. So I've never looked at the stories that I've done and the subject matters and the conversations I've had and really applied them to me personally, because I go into these stories. I've always gone into stories, especially about individuals, about them reading what I wrote about them and learning something about themselves that they didn't know. That's always been the challenge. Because it's easy to write something and, the person that's reading the story doesn't learn anything about themselves.
Yeah.
But this person just took the information I gave and just put it down and did it. No, I want them to have a whole nother experience or experience they never had in their life reading what I wrote about them. I want them to become aware and awake about things about themselves that they didn't know, about either information I found or angles that I took in telling this story. Like, I never applied my life or my career in that way, and now I look at it differently. So that's always been my approach. And in doing that, you never, ever, ever include yourself. Never. So what you just asked, I have never even thought about it. And because of 60, I haven't been reflective on that at all. The only thing I could tell you honestly that, and I've said this for I've said this for probably 35 years, maybe. that the one thing I was going to do when I turned 60 was get my ears pierced. That was it. And the only reason I said I was going to do that because Ed Bradley did it. The great journalist Ed Bradley.
Yeah.
He came on 60 Minutes one time with his ears pierced, and he had to be because his gray beard was working. Yep. And I was like, Ed Bradley was like, you know, my father was a great newspaper reporter, great journalist, legendary in his own right. Ed Bradley was on that segment. Ed Bradley was that guy for me. He's like one of the reasons that when journalists even became a thing, he was that, you know, cats had posters of George Gervin and Farrah Fawcett on their walls. I had pictures of Ed Bradley, you know what I'm saying? So, and Muhammad Ali and Dr. J, whatever. But Ed Bradley was that guy. Yeah. So when he came on air with his ears pierced, I was like, that's the coolest blank I have ever seen in my life. You know, and I wanted to be somewhere between Ed Bradley and Earl Monroe because they were the coolest black dudes ever, you know, as far as, and George Gervin as well. But those two dudes. So I always say when I turn 60, I'm going to get my ears pierced like Ed Bradley so I can be cool like Ed Bradley. So I'm trying to get the beard all gray like Ed Bradley. So I'm working on that part. Go. Yeah, I don't know about the ear. I'm still fluctuating now about the ear thing, but that's the only reflection I've really done on 60, man.
You put it out there. You put it out there.
I mean,
years. Yeah, Ed Bradley, great interviewer, as it sounds like you are as well. As again, when you can, you know, when your subjects can learn something about them that they didn't know because of your writing, that says something about you. Is there anybody that you wish you would have interviewed that you haven't, or you still are trying to get an interview with to tell their story?
That's it. Well, not they tell the story, just to be in the presence of them and seeing, just to be in the presence of them and having the honor of writing something about them. But then they're not here anymore. That's Nelson Mandela. Mm. You know, I just, Nelson Mandela would have been the one. He always is. That's an easy. I've always answered that question now because it always goes down to Nelson Mandela. Yeah. You know, the life that he lived and who he became and what he represents. And to be, you know, I think there are people that go. I think there are people that we either find out about through our times on this earth, either while sharing that airspace with them because they were alive at the same time we happen to be alive, or finding out about them later while they're not here. But there are certain people that I think we can all, that for the most part, we can all look to and know that we should aspire to try to take whatever we can from that person and implement those parts of that people into our lives so we can become better people. And I've always looked at Mandela in that way, that he was a global person that in my lifetime, in your lifetime, we can always look at all the stuff that goes on around us and see how messed up life can be at times. Mm-hmm. But we can look at this one person and realize that what he went through is greater than what we went through. You know, the same way people read books about people and what they went through that religions are built off of. We have a living person that a religion could have been built off of because of what he went through and then what he became. Yeah. You know, his ability to forgive, you know, his ability to survive, you know, his ability to share, you know, those are three great things we all have the ability to do, but 99% of us don't do it at that level. And to me, you know, when those rare people come along, as a person who happens to, you know, be blessed enough to have a career of storytelling, to be a part of my life, meeting that person would be, you know, would be special. You know, that person would be it for me. That person would be it for me. But I'll tell you a real funny story is that I'm not going to say it came close, but there was a situation at ESPN a few years ago that I had to write something in the same week for Kendrick Lamar and Barack Obama. And I'm like, it literally it was like when I mean a week, like within 4 days, I had to write something for both of them. And that's one of those things like, all right, this is pressure. Like, this is pressure. But it was the greatest week of my life because I was like, all right, let's Scoop, let's see what you're about. You know what I'm saying? Let's see what you're really about. So you're welcome. And now I can say I wrote something for Obama. I wrote something for Kendrick Lamar. You know what I'm saying? And they're not, no disrespect, they're not Nelson Mandela, but I've had a moment close to that where I was able to write for two individuals at that level, and I think I came through on both. So,
yes, to say the least, you're quite talented, award-winning, and certainly great stories. And yeah, like you said, Nelson Mandela would be a great interview. What else are you working on now? How can people? Obviously, the book is out, Ice, right now. They can find that wherever they get their books, published by Triumph Books. What else are you working on? What else can we look forward to seeing from Scoop Jackson?
We're actually working on a documentary where I'm script writing for Dominique Wilkins. So Dominique is the next subject of matter. We don't know if there's a book situation in there or not, but definitely the documentary that I'm involved in. So we're in the process of shopping that right now, and treatment's done, all this done. So we're gotten those wheels turning. Got another project that is in talks, another documentary that there's a few other people may be involved that I may play the role of co-director on. I'm being talked into it by somebody. I can't say that person's name because he would kill me if I did. But as I told him, just because I'm the size of Spike Lee doesn't mean that I am Spike Lee. But they're like, they're like, you have to be on board. So we're working on that. Got another book project that's probably coming out in 2024. And doing I'm right now columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times. So doing weekly columns for them. So I'm and a few other irons in the fire. So I'm staying active. I got a lot of things going on.
Sounds like it. I'm sure you're on social media. How can people follow you to keep up with all these things coming up?
Definitely my Instagram account. Instagram account is my company's name, Strong Island Media Shy. Twitter is OG3 Scoop, which is OG because I'm old now. I'm 60, right? And then the 3 is because I'm Robert III, and then Scoop is because Scoop. Facebook is Scoop Jackson Writer, and then there's a LinkedIn page, which is Robert Scoop Jackson. So I'm more I'm not the real social media guy. I post my work up there. I'm like Denzel, man. I try to let my work do my talking. I let the work do the thing. All the things that I'm doing, man. I tell my kids all the time, it'll all come out at the funeral. All the stuff, all the connections, all the stuff I've done will come out at the funeral, man. I'm trying to move in silence and get the work out there. So.
Well, we're happy some of those stories came out before your funeral. Let's leave on this. I know I saw you're a White Sox fan. You're a Knicks fan as well. Which team do you feel better about their chances of eventually winning a championship?
As sad as it is, the White Sox, and as far behind as they are, it's the White Sox because I was about to say something and I don't want to get in trouble for it, but I'll say it this way. I don't think the basketball guys are going to allow James Dolan to get a championship. I just don't think that's going to happen. So, as bad as the White Sox are, and I'm trying to stay in this marriage with the White Sox because it's been a long marriage. I'm trying not to divorce them. I divorced the Knicks a couple of years ago, but now we're back in some type of courtship, because my man Leon's there, Worldwide West is there, Tibbs is there. Jalen Brunson, who I've known since high school, is there. Derrick Rose, Pooh was there for a while. They let Oakley back in the building. So,
yeah,
we're back in courting one another right now with the Knicks. But everybody here in Chicago, man, they're filing divorce papers from the Sox, and I'm trying to hold on, man. I'm trying to hold on with the Sox, but I really, and honestly, man, not trying to be funny. Until the Knicks change ownerships, I really don't see a championship coming their way. I really don't.
Hey, you mentioned Spike Lee, so Spike Lee is not going to be happy until that happens, I guess. Do you go to games? You see Spike Lee? You said you're the same size as him.
You know what? Spike is an idol of mine, man, big time. And I don't get a chance to go to enough Knicks game because I'm in Chicago. But when I do get a chance to go to there, if Spike is there, I definitely holler at him. And my son went to NYU, so he saw Spike a lot. And Spike and I always see each other usually he comes to Chicago every year. to do something with Father Michael Flager, and I always do something with Father Flager. So we see each other there. NBA All-Star games, big events, stuff like that. Yeah, we always bump into him. It's always, an honor. Spike is a huge inspiration and always has been. But he's much more faithful to the Knicks, and I'm faithful to the Knicks, but he's much more faithful to the Knicks than I could be. I had to file my divorce papers, man. I couldn't do it any longer.
Well, here's hoping at some point you get remarried to the Knicks and they get that championship for you. That
Dude,
you're
if we get remarried, there's gonna be a prenup on my end. We're prenupping from the very beginning. I'm telling you right now.
There you go. There you go. Well, Scoop, I appreciate your time. Great stories. Great to meet you. And again, to hear about not only your story, but those of you had a chance to interview. And looking forward to seeing this book again. Ice, it's out now, about George Gervin. You co-wrote it with him. And looking forward to hear about him as a man. It's, behind the scenes as a player, because it seems like, as you said, that's where you get the most impact in the interviews you had with him.
Yeah, it's an amazing journey. And it's one that's, like I said, more about life than it is about his life. And so I think it's, it's I'm not gonna say it's a spiritual read, but it's a very warm, uplifting read. Yeah. So I hope everybody get the chance to get their hands on it and experience, because it was an incredible journey. It was an honor to go on that journey with him. So.
Well, great stuff there from Scoop Jackson. We appreciate his time, and a special thank you to Bill Ames with Triumph Books, once again helping us connect with one of their authors. We thank you for watching and for listening, and remind you and invite you to subscribe to our podcast wherever you get them. We'll have more great episodes coming your way soon. Thanks for joining us. For JR Equipment Behind the Scenes, I'm Mike Vaccaro. We'll see you next time for another edition In the Front Row with Mike Vaccaro. Have a great day, everybody.